Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. You may be seated. Great to see everybody here. Thanks if you're a guest. Thanks for coming, spending a little bit of your Sunday morning with us. We appreciate that. All right, we're going to start with an honesty moment. How many of you in this room have ever made a big mistake? I appreciate very much your honesty. You're just trying to make me feel at home. Big mistakes. I got to tell you, great story, true story. Happened several years ago in Washington, D.C. A lady had been working all day, and she was 5 o'clock, came out of her office, walked down into the large parking lot, and as she approached her car, there were two men getting into her car. She had her handgun in her purse, so she reached into her purse, pulled out the handgun, walked up about 10 feet behind these guys, pointed it at them and said, "You got to the count of 3 to get out of here." Well, she didn't have to count. Man, those two guys ran for their lives. Well, obviously she was pretty shaken, and she kind of took a moment to settle herself down, and she got in her car, and she took her key and put it in the ignition, but it wouldn't fit. Suddenly she realized, this is not my car. Those guys are still running. Big mistake. Somebody sent me this little piece. It's called Mistakes. Doctors' mistakes are buried. Lawyers' mistakes are imprisoned. Accountants' mistakes are fired. Dentists' mistakes are pulled. Pharmacists' mistakes get sick. Plumbers' mistakes leak. Electricians' mistakes are shocking. And carpenters' mistakes are sawdust. Anybody ever made a big mistake? Now, when I'm talking about big mistake, I'm not talking about your routine, run-of-the-mill kind of mistake that we make, daily. No, I'm talking about big mistake. I'm talking about a job ending, a friendship ruining, a divorce causing, a financial bankrupting, a moral failing mistake. I'm talking about the kind of mistake that can bury you and may take years and years, if ever, to recover from. Now, big mistakes, the details may vary, but I promise you the consequences of big mistakes are all the same. After a big mistake, you feel stupid, you feel worthless, you feel useless, you're angry at yourself, you're depressed, you feel trapped. And so you look in the mirror and you kind of conclude, well, I'm washed up, I'm burned out, frankly, I'm broken beyond repair. Anybody ever made a big mistake? Well, welcome back to Wise Guys. This summer, we are looking at the life of people in the Old Testament who demonstrated a level of wisdom at some point. Not totally, but at some point in their life. And we're focusing in on what made them wise guys and what can we learn from their example. Today, we look at the life of a surefire candidate for wise guy status. However, you got to know from the get-go that it was not always the case. The guy we're going to look at today, in his younger years, he could have easily been nominated for stupid guy candidacy. Younger years. I want you to think about those words, younger years. Anybody here have younger years? And you look back at those younger years, anybody look and say, there were times in my younger years that I could have made stupid guy status real easy. Yeah, big mistakes. In his younger years, Moses made some big mistakes. But I got to tell you, when you look at the whole of his life, and that's what we're going to look at today, it gives hope to all people who feel like big losers because they've made big mistakes in their life. Now, what made the difference in Moses' life? In other words, what transformed this guy? Really, what transferred him from stupid guy status to wise guy distinction? We're going to find out today it all happened because Moses made a wise decision. And we're going to read his story, look at his story, and we're going to watch when he makes the transformation, when he makes the transition from stupid guy to wise guy. Now, this is what's really going to encourage you, a lot of you. He didn't make that transition till he was 80 years old. So I'm looking at, I'm going, hey, there's hope for some people here. I mean, some of you are pushing 80, but you're not there yet. Do you think God can still work in your life? No matter how old you are, no matter how many big mistakes you've made in the past. Moses made a wise decision. Now, when you study the life of Moses, it's like watching a 3-act play. Each act is a 40-year period. He lived 120 years. So each act is 40 years. The first 40 years, this is where Moses is born in Egypt. You remember the story of Pharaoh's family taking him in, and he was raised and educated in Pharaoh's court. First 40 years. The second 40 years, Moses is out living in the desert of Midian, herding sheep, working for his father-in-law. The third 40 years, Moses delivers Israel from Egyptian slavery and 40 years in the wilderness to the promised land. 40, 40, 40. I really love the way D.L. Moody summarized the life of Moses. In fact, I put this one in your notes for you. D.L. Moody said, Moses spent the first 40 years thinking he was somebody, the second 40 years learning he was a nobody, and the third 40 discovering what God can do with a nobody. So if you feel like maybe you thought you were somebody and you ended up being a nobody, maybe today you can learn that God can still work in the lives of nobodies. Now, the complete story of Moses, his entire life is found in the book of Exodus. So I thought what we would do today is read the book of Exodus out loud. Would that be okay? Y'all go ahead. What we're going to do today is we're going to look at the Reader's Digest version, and it's actually found in the New Testament, the book of Acts, where his life is summarized by our friend Stephen, and we're going to look at that version, so you can be finding Acts chapter 7. Now, here's the deal. As we read the summary of his life, recorded in Acts chapter 7, here's what we want to look for. The moment Moses made the wise decision, and the difference it made, not only in his life, but the transformational difference it made in the lives of literally millions of people, all because, guys, he made a wise decision. All right? Let's learn from his example so we can learn how to be wise guys by making wise decisions. All right, are you ready? Let me read you the story, Acts chapter 7, beginning in verse 20. At that time, Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months, he was cared for by his family. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. Now, I want you to notice this next line. And was powerful in what? Speech and action. Okay. Now, in other words, in the first 40 years, this guy was articulate, he was eloquent, he was powerful in speech. Now remember that. Let's read on. When Moses was 40 years old, okay, so Act 2, he decided to visit his own people, that would be the Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian. So he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. The next day, Moses came upon two Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, "Men, you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other?" But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner, and he had 2 sons. After 40 years had passed, in other words, he's now 80 years old, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. When he saw this, he was amazed at the sight. As he went over to get a closer look, he heard the Lord say, "I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Moses trembled with fear and did not dare to look. Then the Lord said to him, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. I have indeed seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their groaning and have come down to set them free. Now come, I will send you back to Egypt." This is the same Moses they had rejected with the words, "Who made you ruler and judge?" He was sent to be their ruler and deliverer by God himself through the angel who appeared to him in the bush. He, that is Moses, led them out of Egypt and performed wonders and signs in Egypt at the Red Sea and for 40 years in the wilderness. And now he's 120. All right. What do we need to learn about wise decisions? Number 1, decide to be available for God. That's a big decision. That's a tough decision. Because frankly, many of us like to be available for ourselves. We like to plan our own time, and we like to invest our time and our money in things that we want to be involved in. So the idea of presenting yourself available to God is a radical paradigm shift for many of us. Instead of moi, it's God. All right, let's look at Moses. As the curtain opens for Act 2 of Moses' life, we find this 40-year-old man sitting at a well in Midian. He has just murdered the guy in Egypt and was forced to flee his country. In that process, you got to read the whole story in Exodus 3 and 4, but he is rejected by his own people, the Israelites, and he is rejected by the Egyptians once word gets out that he killed one. We also learn in Exodus 3 and 4 that Pharaoh puts out a warrant for him, dead or alive, and so he flees. He's 40 years old, flees to Midian. He gets married down there and goes to work for his father-in-law herding sheep. And I want everybody to understand the picture of this 80-year-old man, the great Moses, the well-educated, the handsome pride of Egypt, is now an 80-year-old nobody, herding sheep, working for his father-in-law. I want you to imagine for a minute a conversation. Let's just imagine Moses has a conversation with an old classmate from the University of Egypt who happens to be driving through town, and he has lunch with Moses, and he says, "Hey, Moses, haven't seen you in, 40 years now. Tell me, how's your career going?" And Moses says, "Well, not too well. Pharaoh is trying to kill me. I spent the last 40 years living in my father-in-law's basement, and I spend my days herding stupid sheep in the desert. There's my career." I want you to know, guys, here's an 80-year-old man whose big mistake has landed him in the land of nobodies. His life is toast. He's done. It's over. He cannot recover from this big mistake. Then something happens that changes everything. He's out there herding sheep one day, and God speaks to him out of a burning bush. And he calls him to go back to Egypt and deliver the Israelites from Egyptian slavery. Now, if you remember the rest of the story, Moses did not immediately jump on this idea. You remember the story how he made every excuse in the book. At the first he said, I don't think I'm your guy. God, I have kind of a speech impediment. And of course, God is going, nice try, Moses. Hey, I remember in the first 40 years you were eloquent in speech. Remember that when we read? Yeah, he was eloquent in speech. And now out there in the desert, he's lost his ability to speak. And I'm not the right guy. It was, here am I, send Aaron. Put somebody else on the front line. Don't use me. That really shouldn't surprise us. Guys, this is what happens to people who feel like losers. They may have all kinds of gifts, all kinds of talent that was early on in their life demonstrated, but because of a big mistake, their self-esteem is destroyed. And now instead of being eloquent in speech, it's, I don't think I can speak, God. You're going to have to get somebody else. But then Moses decides to be available to God. I mean, it's a fascinating story in Exodus 3 and 4. The back and forth between God convincing Moses, yeah, you are the guy for the job. But when God finally gets through to Moses, Moses makes a great decision. He says, okay, I'm going. And he literally goes and packs up the wife and kids and says, I don't know how we're going to do it, but I have made myself available to God. What a picture. What a picture. That's what God can do with losers if they are available to Him. You see, 40 years in the desert did more than just give Moses a great tan. The desert did something to this guy. It broke his pride. It broke his self-sufficiency. You see, 40 years earlier in Egypt, he decided with his own strength, his own power, and in his own timing, he was going to deliver his people. And it was not God's timing, and it was not going to be by Moses' strength and power. So it took 40 years herding sheep in the desert to break that pride and to break that self-sufficiency. Now we're at the first great lesson we need to learn about wise decisions. So in your notes, before you can be a somebody for God, you must first learn that you are a nobody without God. You are a nobody without God. God is everything. He's going to be your strength. He's going to help you accomplish what you need to accomplish for Him. So let me ask you again, what kind of big mistakes have you made in your life? I'm not talking about the routine ones. No. I'm talking about, for some of you in this room, it was a mistake you made in your past that if people found out, you feel like you would be ruined. If people found out about this one at work, or if your spouse or kids found out about it, they would lose respect. Big mistakes. What's the big mistake that you have made in your past? The life of Moses says, don't despair. Don't give up. No, instead, decide to let that painful experience break your pride, break your self-sufficiency. Let that failure lead you to a wonderful place called humility land. And let God work in your life in your humility. The Bible says very clearly, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the, you've read that, humble. Grace to the humble. Moses made a wise decision. Even though he felt inadequate for the task, even though he felt like his big mistakes in the past disqualified him for the future, he still said, God, I don't know how you're going to do it, but sign me in. Sign me up. I'm available to you. Step one, decide to be available for God. Step two, if you really want to make a wise decision, decide to be flammable for God. I guess this one I better explain, huh? So Moses is out in the desert, herding sheep one day, and he sees something really very unusual. There's a bush on fire. That may not be that unusual, but the sucker won't burn up. It just keeps burning and burning and burning. Now, Moses has been out in the desert. He knows all the vegetation. He knows this is not some special bush. No. This is an ordinary bush. There's nothing special about the bush in and of itself. What makes the bush unique? It's the fire inside the bush that isn't burning up the bush. It just keeps burning. Why? Because God is in the bush. Now, this is very important. God is in the bush. Do you understand that the burning bush is a parable that God is visually communicating to Moses? God is saying to Moses, you're like that bush. Now, you take the fire away, Moses, you're just an ordinary old guy. You're just as ordinary as that bush. But what makes that bush unique and special is not the bush in and of itself, it's the fire within the bush. God is saying to Moses, 40 years ago, I could not use you because you had too much pride, too much anger, too much self-sufficiency. But now, Moses, 40 years later, the desert has finally broken that pride, and now I can finally use you. God wants Moses to see that any old bush will do, and any ordinary old man will do. Even an ordinary guy like Moses with big mistakes in his past, if God is in that person. You see, the power is not in the bush, the power is in the fire. So God is trying to communicate to Moses, hey, Moses, I got great news for failures like you. I'm the God for people who have made big mistakes. The bush is not burned up, and neither are you, Moses, because I am in you. Here's the second great lesson we got to learn this morning. Let's write it down. Any old person will do, even a person like you who has made big mistakes, if God is in you. You see, God wanted to use Moses. He wanted to set him on fire for his purposes. But you got to understand, guys, it wasn't because Moses was so great, so educated, so handsome, so faultless, no mistakes in his past. No. God was able to use Moses because Moses made a decision that day in the desert, standing in front of that ordinary bush that wouldn't go out. He made a decision. God, if you can make that bush stay on fire, then maybe there's hope for me. Maybe you can light a fire in me, even though I've made terrible mistakes, and still let me be usable for you. Now, here's a question for you. Oh, and by the way, this question, it is only addressed to the people who have made big mistakes. So all you perfect people, tune out. What would happen if God tried to set you on fire? Really, think about it. What would happen if God tried to set you on fire for his purposes? How would you react? How would you respond? Would you say, Oh, God, you got the wrong person. I know you need people who are flammable, but I am not flammable. You know, God, I'm kind of like asbestos. I just don't catch on fire. I've made too many mistakes. I'm a big failure. There is no hope for me. You need to go find perfect people or near perfect people. God, I've made too many mistakes. I've ruined my life. I've ruined my reputation. You could never, ever work in the life of a person like me. Really. Listen, if God can do it for an ordinary bush, and if God can do it for a big fat failure like Moses, he can do it for you. I don't take this wrong, but I really don't care about your past mistakes. I mean, I love you and I care about you, but I don't care to hear about your mistakes in the past if you're going to use those to disqualify you from being flammable for the rest of your life. You know what could happen? God might even end up using that big fat mistake that you made. He may end up using that as your greatest ministry to the people around you. You know what God might do? You know that big mistake you made? He may send you into the lives of people who've made that same mistake, and they're stuck out there in the desert going, I'm cooked, I'm done, my life is over. God could never use me to make a significant impact in the world. Maybe God will use you not in spite of your mistake, but because of your mistake. Because you've been there, done that, and you got the t-shirt. Some of you have the sweatshirt and the hat. You may be the most qualified in this room to minister to the lives of people who have made big mistakes in their past. But it only happens if you're willing to be a wise guy and make a wise decision and to say, okay, God, if you can do it for a bush and if you can do it for Moses, then I'm available and I'm flammable. Catch me on fire, God, for your purposes. Let me burn for the rest of my life for your purpose. You know, I was thinking this week, thinking about Moses, I was thinking about the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul must have felt like the New Testament version of the Old Testament Moses. Talk about mistakes. Talk about big mistakes. Do you realize before the Apostle Paul became a Christian, he used to kill them for a living. He used to kill Christians for a living. That's a pretty big mistake. That's one of those, you know, when you stand before God, you're going to go, oh, you mean that was a mistake? Yeah. Good news for Paul, God didn't wait for him to die and stand before him on Judgment Day. Instead, he appeared to him on the Damascus Road. Remember that story? Paul is literally on his way from Jerusalem to Damascus to kill some more Christians. And Jesus, right out the middle of the desert, appeared to him. This was kind of like Paul's burning bush moment. Except it wasn't a burning bush. It was the appearance of Jesus Christ himself. Knocked him off the horse, laying there in the dirt, blinded. Seeing Jesus that day changed Paul's life forever. Just like Moses, that burning bush changed his life forever. And just like Moses on that Damascus road, God called Paul to go to the world, to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. And just like Moses, Paul made a decision to be available and to be flammable, and the rest is history. Now, what interests me, though, in my study this week is that about 20 years after that Damascus Road experience, Paul wrote 2 Corinthians. And one verse caught my attention, chapter 4, verse 7. 2 Corinthians 4, 7. Let's read it out loud. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. Now I want you to notice, look at the first part of that verse. But we have this treasure. The treasure in the context is the good news of Jesus Christ. The good news that Jesus Christ came to save sinners, to save people who had made big mistakes, to redeem them and to transform their lives into new people. And Paul says, we have this treasure, this wonderful gospel of Jesus Christ in what? In beautiful golden jars? No, in just common old jars of clay. Why would God do it that way? Because he wants us to understand that the power is not in the jar. It's not in the jar in and of itself. It's when God is in the jar. Any old jar will do. Any old bush will do. Any old failure will do. Even you and me, if God is in the jar and in the bush and in you. So make the wise decision, like Moses, like Paul, to just be available and to be flammable for God. And who knows, you might just wake up one day and realize you're a wise guy. Let's pray. Father, thank you for putting the story of failures like Moses and Paul in the Bible. I'm so glad this isn't a holy Bible about perfectly holy people, but it's a holy Bible about unholy people that you transformed into holy people. Gives us a great deal of hope today, a great deal of courage, that we can move forward, Lord, in our future regardless of our past. God, I know people in this room who've made terrible mistakes, embarrassing mistakes, stupid mistakes. But God, may today be a day of decision, a day where they draw a line in the sand and step over that line and say, God, my past is just that, my past. I want Jesus Christ to forgive me, to cleanse me, and more than anything, to come inside of me, this ordinary bush, this ordinary jar, this ordinary person. Fill me and empower me for the future. God, we want to make a difference for you. We want the rest of our lives to count. May we today make a wise decision to be available and flammable to you until Jesus Christ takes us home. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.